I mean, just to say that we are very pleased and honored to have here Professor Sadik Al-Azm for presenting his book, which is translated in Italian by Luis University Press with the title La tragedia del diavolo. Of course, the title is symbolic. The book is about the relation between science and faith. The book has been written in 1969 and was after the 6 Days War, which the Arab world lost with Israel. So the book was about the reason for which there's been this crisis, this enormous crisis that certainly began before 1969 and still now is present, as we know. And what is astonishingly evident is that the book written almost 50 years ago is particularly good for today. That I think that's why we are here. The discussion will be conducted in the following way. First, Professor Giovanni Orsina of the Department of Political Science at LUIS will present the author and give the best welcome of the university. Then Professor Alan will speak for about 40 minutes, if he wants, and we will be delighted to hear his voice speaking about the same issues of the book. Then Professor Corrao will comment for about 10-15 minutes, and finally for the first part, Professor Giuliano Amato, President Amato, will comment. After that, younger scholars, but very competent in the area, Dr. Valentina Gentile and Dr. Mohamed Shash, will further comment the book. We are particularly delighted of all that. I mean, I think that it's important to reflect upon the relation between science and faith in the Arab world today. There is something that I think is particularly interesting for us. In the last period, liberal intellectuals try to present what is, broadly speaking, a reconciliation between faith and liberalism in the Arab world. They try to say that if we want a more liberal Arab world, we must go through Islam. This book is on the opposite side. Say that Islam is very dangerous for free thinking in general and from the development of the Arab world, which is a thesis that usually in Europe comes from the right. The fact is that Professor Al-Azm comes from Marxist origins. So we are confronted with a kind of paradox that what is in Europe, the rightist thesis, is maintained by leftist intellectuals. That will be one of the main reasons for discussing with passion and interest this fantastic book. I thank you particularly, Luis University Press, for the very nice translation, and Dr. Rosa, the editor of Luis University Press, for the goodwill to produce the book. Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Professor Orsini with the microphone.
Thank you very much, Sebastiano. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Sadik Al-Azm on behalf of the Department of Political Sciences and of the LUIS School of Government. Professor Al-Azm has been for more than 20 years a professor of European modern philosophy in the University of Damascus and is now Professor Emeritus in the University of Damascus. He has also been visiting professor for many years in the University of Princeton in the United States. He is mostly a philosopher, of course, and a student of Immanuel Kant. To Kant he has devoted many publications. But he's also, as Sebastiano was reminding us, has also been a prominent public intellectual in the Arab world, and not only in the Arab world, notably since the late 1960s, with the publication first a self-critical book of the Arab world after the defeat in the 6 Days War, as Sebastian has already recalled. And then in 1969, this book was published in 1968, and then in 1969 with the publication of the book that has now been translated into Italian by Luis University Press about the critique of religious thought. This book, by the way, is not the first book that Professor Al-Azm has published in Italian, that has been translated in Italian. A first book was translated in the early 2000s on Islamic enlightenment. Professor Al-Azm has won many prizes. I only just recall that he has been very well received in the German world. He has a laurea honoris causa from the University of Hamburg, and last year in 2015 he won the Goethe Medal, which is a very relevant prize in the German world. Possibly Francesca will then add further remarks about Professor Al-Azm. Now I just would like to add a few elements on why Professor Al-Azm's presence is relevant for us in Luis today. Of course, I'm not going to say that what Professor Al-Azm will speak about is relevant for today's world, because this is an absolute platitude. I mean, the relationship between Islam, modernity, and democracy is one of the most relevant challenges of our world, possibly the most relevant, certainly one of the most relevant. So this is certainly of great interest for us all, to try and discuss the relationship between Islam, religion, science, modernity, and democracy. More specifically, though, I think that this is quite relevant for us in Luis, because in Luis we have two traditions, a more ancient tradition of reflection on the relationship between religion and politics, and a more recent tradition in Islamic studies. And of course, thinking about Islamic religion, politics, and science and modernity is the crossing point of these two traditions. Luis used to be, I am an historian, so I tend to look at things in the long term. Luis used to be a religious university until the late 1970s. It was called Prodeo, a Catholic university, and since the late 1970s has become a secular university. Of course, we are in Rome, so it's quite difficult not to reflect about the relationship between religion and politics, being in Italy, specifically in Rome, and being in a university that used to be Catholic and then has become a secular university. So it's a pleasure for me to remind the two professor emeriti of this university, Professor Luciano Pellicani and Professor Dario Antiseri, that since the 1980s started reflecting and quarreling a lot and discussing about the relationship between religion and politics, having two very different ways of looking at this relationship. So we don't only have a tradition of reflection on these topics, we also have a tradition of, let's say, competitive reflection, one can say quarrelsome reflection on these topics, always with great friendship, of course, and civilization, but also with very different takes on that. These are Professor Emeriti of Luis, but in more recent times we have had other scholars that have been reflecting a lot on these topics. I'm only going to, of course, to mention Professor Sebastiano Maffettone, who is here at this table, but also Professor Leonardo Morlino, who is a renowned scholar on topics of democracy, and that is to say, of course, among the many issues that he's taking into account when it comes to democracy and the quality of democracy and the processes of democratization, of course, is religion. But also younger scholars such as Valentina Gentile, who's here today, and she's going to discuss Professor Al-Azm's book, but also Vera Capperucci, who is a historian working on the Christian democracy, that is to say, on the Italian version of the problem of the relationship between religion and politics. Last but not least, in more recent times, we have added a strand of Islamic studies and Mediterranean studies. And of course, here we have Francesca Corrao, who is the leader of this tradition of studies. And in this tradition of studies, in the last years, we have created a master in Islamic studies, in Islam, that is taught within the Luis School of Government, and that, of course, is considered by the Luis School of Government a great investment on not only, of course, on such a relevant topic such as Islamic politics, economy, and the studies of the Islamic world, but an investment on the part on an institution that is Italian and that is Roman. That is to say, is in the middle of the Mediterranean and has a geographic vocation for reflecting on these kinds of topics, for thinking the Mediterranean, thinking about the other, what we consider, of course, the southern shore, the other shore of the Mediterranean. That being said, I've taken enough time. Last thing, once again, let me welcome very warmly Professor Al-Azm for being here. Thank you.
So, Professor Al-Azm, it's up to you. Thank you very much, Giovanni, for a very nice presentation.
Yes. Okay, good. Well, first of all, I am going to express my deep gratitude for the invitation and the hospitality and the privilege of being at Lewis University and, of course, speaking to its scholars and students. Special, of course, thanks are to Professor Corrao, whom I've known for many years, and Professor Maffettone, and we have had several encounters and activities together in the past. Now, the Arab original of the book I am revisiting with you this morning has been on the market in the Arab world without interruption for about half a century. While it has been formally banned in every Arab country except Lebanon, where it was published, it is available to anyone in any Arab country who wants to read it or who wants to burn it. In the first edition was in Beirut in 1969, sold out immediately, while the remaining copies were confiscated by the Lebanese authorities at the behest of the Grand Mufti of Lebanon at the time, Hassan Khalid. Consequently, the Attorney General referred author, publisher, and book to the appropriate court for trial on charges of, quote, inciting confessional strife in the country, that is in Lebanon. The book sparked the most sensational Arab literary scandal of the second half of the 20th century. Reviewers immediately compared it to the two most famous such scandals in the first half of the 20th century, namely Ali Abdel Razak's daring book Islam and the Foundations of Governance, Al-Islam Usul al-Hukm, Cairo 1925, which argued from inside Islam for the separation of state and religion in contemporary Muslim societies, and in effect justified Ataturk's abolition of the caliphate in 1923. The second instance was Taha Hussein's unorthodox volume on Jahili poetry, that is on pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, Cairo 1926, which upset much of the received medieval wisdom and approaches to the subject of Jahili poetry. Critique of religious thought eventually generated about 1,500 pages of controversy, polemics, rebuttals, refutations, and responses, and some rare defenses. The main thrusts of all these rejoinders and refutations was to reaffirm and fortify the traditional narratives of Islam against my skeptical criticisms and my rational questionings. And second, to prove again the veracity of those elements of the scriptures and faith that I had described as myth. By the way, the problem of the meaning and role of myth in Islam, and by implication, the possibility of demythologization, figured prominently in the trial and in the rejoinders and refutations to the book. This went on for many months, especially in Lebanon. In a formal declaration by the Mufti, which was not quite a fatwa, like the famous fatwa for Salman Rushdie, the Mufti of Lebanon condemned author and book for blasphemy against Islam and apostasy and atheism. Interestingly enough, no disturbances of the peace occurred anywhere in protest against what was presented then as a vicious attack, not only on religious thought, but also on religion itself. At the time, Arab popular public opinion and attention were still stupefied and paralyzed by the devastating Arab defeat in the Six-Day War with Israel in June 1967. Throughout the commotion, author and book were denounced in many a mosque in the course of the Friday prayer sermons. This went on for several months, especially in Lebanon. Now I would like to give a bit of background as to the making of critique of religious thought in the context of its time and place. This will be at two levels. First, a personal level, and second, at a politico-cultural ideological level. At the personal level, my own secondary education was at the American Presbyterian High School in Sidon, Lebanon. In accordance with the Protestant traditions, we all attended Bible classes. It was there that I first formally encountered Christmas, so to speak. As in the verse from Matthew, and the angel came in unto her and said, Fear not, Mary, for thou hast found favor with God, to the end of the Matthew account. At the same time, these same Presbyterians gave us such a thoroughly modern education that by the time we finished high school, we had stopped believing in angels, genies, devils, magic, and miracles. Later on, at the American University of Beirut, Descartes' methodological doubt, John Locke's demolition of the doctrine of innate ideas, and the Socratic principle of the examined life pretty much finished the conventional belief job. At least for a lot of us, like myself. I mention this because many of my books' questionings, doubts, and passages dealing with the problem of the ethics of rational belief are traceable to this specific educational experience of mine and of plenty of others like myself. As for the politico-cultural aspect of the time, the two major essays in the book were written in the early 60s. That is, at very exciting and promising times of decolonization, Arab nationalism, Arab populism, Arab socialism, and Arab third worldism. Especially in those days, the powerful drive for our underdeveloped societies to catch up with the developed ones. It all gave the left-of-center intelligentsia of those days the sense of being part of what seemed like a new, brave world in the making. Because of the ambitions, promises, and zeal of those times, there was deep political and intellectual dissatisfaction with the continuing inertness and conservatism of Arab thought and culture at a time of seemingly progressive socio-economic changes and third worldist projects of modernization, growth, and catching up with the developed world. Questions about the role of modern science and technology in our underdeveloped societies were very much on the agenda, especially their possible impact on traditional culture, inherited systems of belief, and the conventional religious understandings of the world. Ideas were circulating then about the urgent need for the critical interpretation, reinterpretation, and updating of Islam's theology, law, and conventional narratives, particularly undoing the overly literal reading and comprehension of scriptures. Above all, the prevalent conventional superstructural frames of law, religion, culture, institutions, values, norms, roles, and so on, were widely perceived as obsolete obstacles to be disposed of, hindering and delaying the progressive socio-economic transformations supposedly taking place at the level of society's base and its infrastructural elements and processes. I will now present two typical samples of the impatient, harsh, and radically critical temper of those times concerning all these matters. The first sample comes from the manifesto designed by Adonis for those heady days. As many here know, Adonis, along with Mahmoud Darwish, is the Arab world's most prominent and internationally recognized poet. For long years, Adonis, a major force in contemporary Arab letters, thought, and culture in general. His manifesto declares, quote, "As revolutionary Arabs, what we aspire to and work for is laying the foundations of a new age for the Arabs. We know that instituting a new age presupposes from the very beginning a complete break with the past. We also know that the starting point of this founding break is criticism. The criticism of all that is inherited, prevalent, and common. Where the role of criticism here is not limited to exposing and laying bare whatever prevents the establishment of a new age, but extends to its destruction. Our past is a world of lostness in a variety of religious, political, cultural, and economic forms. It is a realm of the unseen and illusory, which continues and extends. It is a realm that not only hinders the Arab from finding himself, but also presents him, the Arab, from making himself. And since the structure of prevalent Arab life and culture is based on religion, we understand very well the dimensions of Karl Marx's statement to the effect that the criticism of religion is the condition for all other criticism. Then we can say that the revolutionary criticism of the Arab heritage is the condition for any revolutionary Arab action, unquote. The second sample comes from Yassin al-Hafiz, a left-wing Syrian intellectual, theoretician, and political militant of that period. He boldly calls for, quote, a critique of all aspects of actually existing Arab society and its traditions. A strict scientific and secular critique is one of the fundamental obligations of the revolutionary Arab socialist vanguard in the Arab homeland. Such a critique alone is capable of readying the conditions which permit the uprooting of all the negative, inhibiting, and disabling aspects of our social existence. Exploding the traditional frames of Arab society will lead precisely to an acceleration of the rate of work on the construction of a completely modern Arab society. Without this act of exploding, the possibility of a systematic, speedy, and revolutionary development of the traditional intellectual and social structures of the Arab people becomes questionable, if not impossible, unquote. These radical calls remained programmatic in the sense that neither Adonis nor Yassin al-Hafiz proceeded to carry out in specifics or to implement in detail the kind of critiques and the kind of epistemological breaks with the dead hand of the past that they emphatically called for. So in retrospect, I now see that the work I was doing at the time is the practical application and implementation of the programmatic goal of the zeitgeist as expressed in Adonis's and Yassin's manifestos. Now I also know that I was not conscious at the time that I was in effect implementing such a program. It all came spontaneously and unself-consciously at the time. A good example is my use of belief systems internal to Islam to rework the Quranic story of the fall of Satan, Iblis, in terms of modern concepts of tragedy and the drama of trying existential choices. That is dealing with the Quranic story as mythical raw material for good, up-to-date literature. Not unexpectedly, the result scandalized orthodoxy in the Arab world, both Muslim and Christian. Another example is found in the critical, candid, and debunking way in which I handled the then burning issue of the impact of the drive for progress, modernization, and updating on the traditional Muslim Weltanschauung and its cosmology in particular. It all seemed to take us back to the old problem of the clash of reason and revelation, the classical clash of science and religion, and more specifically of science and Islam. What incensed orthodoxy was the playful, sarcastic, and uneuphemized language I used in dismissing, without fear or favor, all the silly and comical pontifications of higher clerical authorities and most prestigious religious ulama and chiefs, pontifications about the perfect harmony and compatibility of science and Islam, to the point of deriving Islam from science and deriving science from Islam without a remainder, instead of separating the two for everybody's peace of mind. At the height of the scandal, I was approached by some colleagues and fellow Arab intellectuals in Europe proposing the translation of the book into English and French. I was skeptical then about the value of such a translation for European thought and European intellectual interests. I responded by saying, my book is a Marxist Enlightenment critique of religious thought, something very, very déjà vu in English, French, and most other European languages and cultures. It was the assertive rise of Islamic fundamentalism after the Arab-Israeli October War of 1971 revived interest in the book, both locally and beyond. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks in New York and the Pentagon, it was an American colleague, Blair Gatsby of Scottsdale, Arizona, who proposed again a translation of the book into English to make it available to as wide a readership as possible. I am deeply indebted to him for initiating this translation project, eventually completed by George Sturgis of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and myself. The chapter on the apparition of the Virgin in a Cairo church in 1968 sought to expose the manipulation and politics of deceit of the Egyptian military security establishment then, which exploited the miracle to deflect popular attention away from the defeat itself. This essay bears all the painful marks of the devastating trauma experienced by the 60th generation in the Arab world after that defeat. The trauma signaled the precipitous collapse of the reigning politico-cultural amalgam of Arab nationalism, Arab populism, and Arab third worldism. In my contribution to Arab self-criticism after the defeat, I felt that some form or other of conservative revivalist Islam would proceed to fill the resulting vacuum. The politico-cultural center of the Arab world was already shifting from progressive Nasserist Egypt to reactionary Wahhabi Saudi Arabia. I had assumed at the time that the returning Islam would be more escapist and consoling than aggressive and violent. After discussions and consultations with my left-wing publisher in Beirut and with various friends and fellow intellectuals, I concluded that collecting my critical essays, those from before and after the defeat, and publishing them in a book could form a stimulating and challenging contribution to the debates and controversies raging in the Arab world over the defeat and its consequences for the Arabs and their future. I did not assume or anticipate that the book would result in a literary scandal of such proportions. The Sunni clerical establishment in Lebanon and its allies spearheaded the campaign against the book, referring both author and publisher and book to the courts on various charges. The Christian clerical establishment was divided. One part disapproved thoroughly of the book on the grounds that any criticism and or skepticism about religion is dangerous and destabilizing in our societies, as it undermines the basic belief systems of the common people. The other part of the Christian the Christian hierarchy, especially in Lebanon, the other part cautiously welcomed the book and the resulting affair as a positive and refreshing development inside a stale and stagnant system of Islamic thought and belief. Since the critical questionings and skeptical approaches of the book dealt primarily with Sunni religious thought, the Shia clerical establishment in Lebanon assumed a well-calibrated and measured position of tolerance and understanding towards the book and the attendant polemics. For example, the most venerable Shia alim and theologian in the country at the time, Muhammad Jawad Maghniya, wrote saying that he disagreed with all the ideas and arguments of the book, but he believed that if Islam failed to take serious account of the issues, dilemmas, and problems raised by Al-Azm, then Islam was the loser. Lebanon's chiefs and politicians contributed their bit to the controversy and sensation. The statements they made and positions they took concerning the controversy were often motivated less by principle than by their internal rivalries and personal animosities. After my brief imprisonment in Beirut, the case was brought to trial in the spring of 1970. It was a sensational political trial par excellence. 4 of Lebanon's most prominent lawyers volunteered to take on the case pro bono and act as the defense on behalf of author, publisher, and book. The point of the whole exercise was to placate the Mufti and the Sunni clerical establishment. Kamal Jumblat, Lebanon's chief Druze leader and Minister of Interior at the time, Jumblat himself, a cultivated aesthetic intellectual and Lebanon's most prominent personality in the Arab world and internationally. Jumblat was attacked by his political foes in Lebanon for seeming partial to the book. He certainly acted to protect me from harm and from being deported from the country immediately after the imprisonment. I remain grateful to him to this day. Amusingly, while there was a warrant for my arrest and the police were supposedly searching for me, the Minister of Interior and the Chief of the Police, Kamal Jumblat, invited me unofficially to visit him in his office at the Ministry of Interior, where we spent several hours discussing theses concerning the book, religion, philosophy, science, local and world affairs. Then I returned safely to my hiding spot in Beirut. Jumblat was harshly attacked by his foes for this unorthodox behavior. The incident was a classical instance of the Lebanese way of handling and diffusing a crisis situation. Again, before turning myself into the Lebanese authorities, I spent time hiding in Damascus, waiting for a deal with the court so I would not spend too much time in prison before the trial. The Damascus Mukhabarat, the secret services, said, "You are welcome here in Damascus as long as you keep silent, you keep quiet. For a Christian state, Lebanon, is after you for attacking Islam, and we are a Muslim country." They canceled a public lecture on Palestine that had been announced weeks before. Many observers noted that this was amazingly the first case of a Syrian intellectual running away from Lebanon to take refuge in Syria, as the normal flow was always from Syria to Lebanon. Of amusing interest, too, is that when I met with my eminent lawyers in preparation for the defense, I heard them trading hyperbolic statements about how Islam from time immemorial had believed in and protected freedom of thought and expression. When I commented to the lawyers that that was not true at all, they ordered me to shut up and do as they say if I want to stay out of prison. At the trial, I responded to the charge of inciting confessional strife in Lebanon by affirming that the charge would stick if I had attacked the Christian confession in favor of the Muslim confession, or vice versa. But I really dismissed both of them without fear or favor. In the end, the court dismissed the case, and the prosecution decided not to appeal the verdict, in spite of calls to do so from various clerics and their followers. An informal public opinion bloc had formed in Lebanon, made of secular nationalists, left-wing forces and parties, professional associations, liberals, secularists, militant Palestinians, progressive intellectuals of all stripes, and much of the local press. there was informal support from similar blocks made up of similar elements in other countries, Arab countries. The spontaneous pressure of these blocks contributed greatly to my acquittal and the prosecution's waiving of the appeal. The book created an embarrassing dilemma for communists and those on the left. On the one hand, criticism of religion impedes the ability of the left to organize the popular masses. On the other hand, Marx called religion the opium of the people and regarded the criticism of religion as, quote, the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo, unquote. For Marx, the criticism of religion is the beginning of all other criticism of contemporary society, economy, and life. The left-wing press and chiefs navigated the quandary by floating above it, affecting something like close to neutrality in covering the book, the controversy and the political ideological fallout. In other words, the left acted in public as a reluctant supporter of the book and of author in spite of their Marxism, while the informal popular opinion blocs tended to defend the book on principle without necessarily adopting its contents. All in all, Critique of Religious Thought was a 60th generation book. Let us recall that the 60th generation produced practically everywhere around the world highly articulate and fresh theoretical and practical critiques of the then established orders, socially, politically, economically, culturally, denouncing them for their inequalities, injustices, barbarisms, hypocrisies, and oppressions at all levels, international, regional, and local. It was all done from the perspective of a new and refreshingly naive sense of hope and possibility for a better and more humanly emancipated future. Let us recall as well that the 60th generation was fearless, contentious, noisy, polemical, iconoclastic, defiant, existentialist Marxist, espousing a kind of creative nihilism vis-a-vis what was and what is, and aiming at making all of that a part of direct transformative action, socially, politically, and culturally. I want to claim that within its own compass, Critique of Religious Thought embodies and reflects much of the above distinguishing characteristics, traits, and spirit of the 60th generation. Beirut was the capital of the Arab 60th generation par excellence. Here, a salute of gratitude is due to Lebanon and especially Beirut. With Arab societies living under the crushing weight of very repressive and suffocating systems of rule and government, then as now, Lebanon, for its own reasons, was the only exception. Despite the debilitating faults of this small Arab country, it gives the Arab 60th generation everywhere the only relatively free political and cultural space to express itself and speak out. For my generation, Beirut was the cultural hub and indispensable center for public debate and discussion, as well as for a decent margin of free expression and uncensored publishing. I believe my book will remain significant and relevant within the Arab Islamic universe of discourse, given the total sterility of the traditional centers of Islamic and Sharia study and learning, such as Al-Azhar in Cairo, Zaytuna in Tunis, and their counterparts everywhere else, including the various Sharia faculties attached to many of our national universities. No interesting ideas, innovative interpretations, or systematic reconsiderations and revisions have come out of these centers of learning for a very, very long time. The dominant climate in these centers remains extreme conservatism, resentment, apology, and rote learning. Formal Islamic thought has rarely benefited from attempts to come to terms with modernity, particularly modern science and modern socio-political institutions. In fact, in the Arab world and over the last 2 centuries, such attempts took the form of a descending historical dialectic, a series of desperate steps backward into medievalism, ignorance, and violence. For example, the movement of modern reform in Islamic theology, thought, and law of the end of the 19th century regressed from Afghani's revolutionism to Muhammad Abdo's mere latitudinarianism and adaptism, an adaptism that gave way in the next generation to the theological conservatism and political reaction of Rashid Rida, a student of Muhammad Abdo. That conservatism slid further back into the restorationism and fundamentalism of Hassan al-Banna and the organization he founded in 1928, the Muslim Brothers Organization. And then the next generation, even further backward, in Sayyid Qutb's jihadism against the Jahiliyyah of the 20th century, as explained in his famous and very influential book, Signposts. This descending dialectic reaches its logical and practical nadir in the 4 following phenomena. First, Abdul Salam Faraj's seminal tract, Jihad, the Absent Commandment, Al-Farida Al-Ghaiba, 1981, in Egypt. Second, the extravagant violence of the Islamic Jama'at in Egypt in the 1980s. Third, in bin Laden's spectacular terrorism on a global scale. And the blind jihadism and barbarism of his children and inheritors, including Daesh today, ISIS, that is. Given this historical descending dialectic, instead of ascent, it was a descent. Shocking books, critical ideas, challenging interpretations, and provocative readings like Critique of Religious Thought remain both relevant and necessary. There have been other thinkers and other works that share the critical spirit of my book, often writing from within Islam and who represent glimmers of vitality and hope within the dominant narrative of regression and despair. The most prominent instances are the following. Egypt's Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd and his historical rereadings of Islam, Sharia, and the Quran itself, as in his famous book, Critique of Religious Discourse, 1994, which provoked a significant Egyptian and Arab literary scandal, leading to his exile in the Netherlands for many years. Also his engaging volume, التفكير في زمن التكفير, trying to think in an age of takfir, apostatization, in 1995. Then we have Muhammad Shahrur and his from Damascus, his semantically and linguistically based radical reinterpretations of Islam, Sharia, and the Quran, mainly in his first book, The Book and the Quran, a Contemporary Reading, Damascus, 1990. Shahrur's work provoked censure, attack, refutations from Orthodox and fundamentalist Islam. Now, a Shahrur reader is available in English, Brill 2009. Then we have Algeria's Mohamed Arkoun and his attempt to apply French discourse theory and postmodern semiotic methods and approaches to the rereading of the Quran, Sharia, and Islam in general. Arkun's books too provoke much heat from orthodoxy while shedding much light within contemporary Islamic thought. It is especially telling that none of these three radical reformist thinkers emerged from the traditional centers of Islamic learning, and that nothing that has emerged from those traditional centers has approached the works of these three thinkers in terms of political courage and intellectual interest. I will end by reading a couple of operative paragraphs from the quasi-fatwa issued against the book and author as it appeared in the press in Lebanon in January 8, 1970. The headline read, "Statement of the Mufti of the Republic, Lebanon, about the book Critique of Religious Thought. The writer and the book and all those who support him are outside of Islam. A duty of the state is to apply the law to punish opponents of religion." Then the declaration of the Mufti goes on to say, "There are holy things in Islam that cannot be infringed or disparaged for any cause or reason. God, His angels, the jinn, heaven, hell, judgment, reward, punishment, Adam's creation from earth, the exalted and mighty gods commanding Satan to prostrate himself to Adam, the refusal of Satan to obey the command of his God, all this and other similar things that appear in the Quran and Sunnah are absolute immutable truths in Islam. Faith in them is an obligatory religious duty for every Muslim, and doubt or the encouragement of doubt in them, or some of them, is a blatant blasphemy that places a Muslim outside of Islam." Following the deniers or going on with them, supporting their ideas and justification, all that by invoking the freedom of opinion is a rejection of God's command and thus a straying from religion. By a miracle, I'm still alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that everyone appreciates the way in which you present your thesis within the context of that time and now. And I think also very interesting the reference you made to 1960s in Europe, which was an age, of course I remember well, in which this creativity and protest were still very strong and significant. Now I give the floor to Francesca Corrao for commenting your beautiful presentation.
Thank you very much for Sadik Al-Azm, and thank you very much to Luis giving us the opportunity to make Sadik come back here to Luis again, and to the colleagues who were ready to share his initiative. Also because it is extremely important from my point of view, open the table to different kind of dialogues in this historical moment. Just yesterday we were discussing with Sadik about the fact we don't only need interreligious dialogue, but we need inter-philosophical dialogue, intercultural, inter-literature, inter-women. I mean, we have to exchange as much as possible, because what came out from his speech is that even if it is very difficult to innovate the Arab or the Islamic thought in the Middle East, especially in these last days, there is an important group of intellectuals of different ideologies discussing with strong courage against those who are trying to bring those countries back to the Middle Age. It is quite interesting listening to his position about Sunni and Shia, because Sunni and Shia, we imagine that they are ideologically, of course religiously, opponents since the day of Kerbala, when the kids of Ali, the cousin of the Prophet, were killed. So we understand that within the very starting community of Islam, there has been a serious problem about how to legitimate power. And this is the question, the issue. How to legitimate power. How to give the opponents the possibility to say their opinions. So the history of Islam, and that is why they hate him, since the beginning, is characterized with fiercely opposition that takes to terrible war against the opponents, against those minorities who had in the Middle Age to express themselves in religious terms. But it is very difficult to explain now in 5 minutes the story. I will remind my book on Islam, politics and faith that is going to come out soon in English. But what concerns us, just to make you understand what we're talking about, when we heard what happened to Regeni, it is terrible, but since 60 years it is taking place in the Middle East. And we don't need to read newspaper, but just novels. From novels, we will learn how difficult it is for the opponents to resist. Of course, we have to go back to very enlightened kings or political representative to find the possibility to open the discussion with the opponents. And we have the example, he was mentioning the example of Jumlat, a great intellectual, and I would call, for instance, the role the King of Morocco had played in the reform of the code for the condition of the woman in modern times, or the role Bourguiba had it in Tunis in the 50s. It is always thanks to very enlightened intellectuals and politicians to keep open the door of debate. More recently, last year, here at Lewis, we had an important meeting reminding another important philosopher, Mohammed al-Jabari. Mohammed al-Jabari was putting forward this great problem. How to dialogue without being accused of apostasy. Because the problem with apostasy is that then anybody can come and kill you, like what happened to Rushdie, which is a serious problem. There cannot be a discussion if you are threatened to be killed. And what is needed is a fair, calm discussion between people having different opinions. And this is why he is claiming for a secular state. Because a secular state will grant Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever, atheist or laik, the possibility to discuss. But this is touching the reading of the religious principle, like declaring the Sunnah holy.
But then the Sunnah is not holy because human being wrote it. The traditions were written by human beings. They were not the words of God. And the reality is that a very prominent intellectual, Mahmoud Taha, was killed in Sudan because he had dared to say so. So you can understand how difficult it is and how it is important to get close to these arguments that seem so far away for us, even if we have the same problems in the 19th and 18th centuries. And we might have it even today. The core of the question is when we face a crisis. Because a crisis is putting us in front of a radical changement. And a radical changement is bringing about a loss. And in front of a loss, what is put in cause is identity. And it is at that moment that you get stuck to your previous memory. And you get terrified at the idea of putting into discussion your identity. Because it is too much to have and to be shaken from outside and from within. So how did the Middle Eastern society face these difficulties of great change, this facing modernity? In the words of three great women, give me the possibility to mention them, from the Arab world, which are Sadik Al-Azm, Iraqi poet. The other one, and she was Sunni, but she was very secular. The other one, I would say, Fahmiya Sharafuddin, she was also our guest here, and she is Shiite, but she is absolutely secular. Or Khalida Said, she's a Syrian, and she is the wife of Adonis. We always read about Adonis, but we don't know about the ideas of Khalida. Khalida Said, she is a brilliant intellectual. She wrote a beautiful book recently, repeating the same things that Sadik Al-Azm was saying in the 40s, more or less. That the power has to go and get an agreement with the religious most conservative in order to be there. And the point is that the price of this agreement is paid by women. So if we don't have the possibility to give women the same room as men, how can we build dialogue? How can we build democracy? How can we talk about liberalism? Especially if we start discussing, and the moment we innovate, we are accused, generally speaking, of course, I'm talking about Sadik Al-Azm, who had the courage of innovate and critique. He had the courage, as he said, to apply what Adonis said, because Adonis was revolutionary in the 56, but then he did not really apply these theories, and he fled to Paris. But Adonis and the group of poets of the review Share were accused to be financed by the CIA. Just to make you understand how it is difficult to have a different opinion. And just to close, the crisis is not only 1967. Nowadays, we realize that the great crisis for the most conservative religious group was the end of the caliphate. So back to 1924. And it is in fact when Rashid Reda, it was mentioning before, who was the student of Abdu, who were the innovators, he became extremely conservative. And from there again, Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brother, and after the crisis of the 67, they became much more conservative until we arrived to the newly born caliphate. Because it is a problem of price, and it is a problem of looking backward to find an answer to the present day crisis. And it is a disaster in the moment where you are not able to face the other. That is, someone of your same group proposing innovation, because innovation is considered to be the door to apostasy. And it is a false, of course. So, what is important for us, being all of us citizens of this Mediterranean area, is to dialogue. And we should start, because we are the supporter of liberalism, to support dialogue and defend the rights of human beings to the freedom of speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for this nice contribution. I think you're definitely right. What we need is dialogue, and this presupposes freedom of thought and women's rights. Now I give the word to Professor.
May I say something?
Oh, okay.
Apropos, the question of dialogue being, in literature, culture, and women, and so on. One aspect I did not mention or emphasize in my talk, that in Lebanon, in the 60s also, was a problem of a lot of restlessness in Lebanon, which in retrospect you see that it was the prelude for the coming war, the coming civil war. And they had, at the time, something called the Muslim-Christian dialogue. And it was mainly conducted by the hierarchies and the ayatollahs of the Christians and the ayatollahs of the Muslims. They were, the dialogue. And I intervened and criticized and condemned the hypocrisy and the sterility of what was being said or as called a dialogue. And in the end, it proved that what was the dialogue between Islam and Christianity in Lebanon proved to be the preparation really for the civil war that started in 1975. Now, the problem in these cases, when they dialogue even about culture or literature or women and so on, it all ends up, literature, it gets reduced to religion, the woman gets reduced to religion, culture gets related to religion. There is no escape from that with them. And this is why I thought, that a frontal critical attack is necessary and needed for that.
Yes, I start from this last point of yours. A critical attack, a radical attack is necessary. And it depends on the use of religion that you have to face. This is quite clear, and you make it clear in your book. Because, of course, in theoretical terms, when you speak of the opposition between science and religion, between reason and revelation, and you are, at least from my angle, necessarily correct. Because, as you write, science looks ahead. Science is our creativity producing something new. Religion, in terms of revelation, is something that occurred in the past and that binds you, and you have to stick there. And if what you are doing or creating or inventing is not consistent with that truth, you are out. Now, all of the problem of the somehow compatibility between religions and reason is how you handle the religious truth. Whether it's something untouchable or is something that can also be molded by human experience. All of our religions have faced in their history both approaches. Islam before Christianity, because 1,000 years ago it was, as you know, a great philosopher and scientist, Averroes, here in Europe, preaching how to combine reason and religion, science and revelation. There are limits for any secular mind, there are limits to this compatibility, but an effort can be made to reach some sort of, let's say, mutual understanding, to put it this way, which does not happen. You can be sure that it does not happen when political power is based and claims to be based on the Word of God. The Word of God remains the main source of legitimacy of public power. And it is obvious then that when you have religious feelings prevailing in your population, you tend to legitimize yourself as being the interpreter, the right interpreter of the Word of God. We should never forget this contamination of religion by political expectations, designs, and aims, which is made clear by the book, because also the Virgin Mary was used after the defeat of the 6 Days War in 1967. 67 to somehow create a different context from the unavoidable result of that war, in which several Arab states were defeated by a small Israel and very powerful militarily. At that point, God is with us is an essential reassurance for the holders of the defeated powers. And it is there the origin of the troubles of this book, and quite clearly of the firm position of the book on behalf of science. Because if you say that this is the Word of God, I respond that this Word of this God is against reason and against science. It's not only a leftist dilemma. It is a dilemma of any secular revolution, actually. And of course, it also occurred after the French Revolution, which was not a communist one, but had to face the same dilemma that you so clearly illustrate in your book. I understand that my citizens share deeply religious feelings. At the same time, I'm aware that religion might, this was the position of the French revolutionaries, might oppose reason and science, is prejudice, superstition, irrational beliefs. So if I want freedom, if I want rational dialogue, I have to eliminate religion from my public discourse. And this what was done after the French Revolution. Religion has to remain because we believe in freedom, but religion will be a private affair and won't have access to the public sphere. Now, in a recent book that I found extremely provocative and also Michael Walzer, the title of the book is The Paradox of Liberation. Of liberation. The paradox of liberation. What's the paradox? The paradox is that in order for me to liberate my country, I have to oppose religion, because religion is the bunch of principles that have been used by the pre-existing power to affirm itself and now to defend itself. Principles that are used to limit and to deny the liberty and the dignity of my citizens, and therefore I have to get rid of these. So there are frequently liberation movements that tend to be rigidly secular. This was the case, if not of Gandhi personally, of Nehru in India, when the new independent government was established. This was the well-known case of Ataturk and the Kemalists in Turkey. This was the case of Algeria, Ben Bella, etc., and other cases. Now, what happens, this is what Michael Walzer notices, that in these countries, in these very countries, after some years, we have a religious revival which is nurtured by fundamentalist positions and feelings. And the question, very much unpleasant for us secular exponents, is there a connection between your initial effort to eradicate religion and the fact that religion, which had remained widely shared among your citizens, is now restoring itself, and restoring itself in terms that tend to be radical? Because it was an excess there that is calling for an excess now. This is quite a question. You see, I found very telling an example that Walzer gives in cases in which the first prohibition of religious habits, of habits due to religious beliefs, came from the colonial power and then was confirmed by the new independent power. And now the religious revival says, you see, this is what they wanted us to do. The example is the sati, which is one of the most horrible rites that still are used. The sacrifice of the widow when the dead husband is burned and she enters into the fire and dies. The sati was abolished by the British government in 1829, and of course the prohibition was confirmed by the independent Indian government in 1948-49. Now, I read, there are positions in India arguing that sati makes sense. It is still prohibited, but it is challenged. The prohibition is challenged. Here, the teaching of these kind of experiences, getting rid of the political use of religion is essential. Getting rid entirely of religion is, to say the least, dangerous, because it remains, it is there. As you well know, this is the conclusion that has been reached widely in the European Union and in our communities now, after Habermas and the acceptance of the notion of post-secular society, we have restored religion as one of the legitimate components of the public sphere deliberations and debates. Of course, the decision in the public sphere remains for the legitimate secular institutions, but religion can enter. Is something like this conceivable in countries where Islam is majoritarian nowadays, and it is politically used? The tragedy is that it is not conceivable nowadays. But of course, something can be noticed. The example of Ataturk was not followed in Tunisia, for instance, where the influence of the Brotherhood was less than in Egypt. The case of Egypt was a disaster and still is a disaster. But the case of Tunisia demonstrates that also in a country nowadays with this kind of majoritarian positions, trying a common understanding, both politically, between the Muslim party and the secular parties. There is a coalition run in Tunisia nowadays. And in terms of culture, the Tunisian constitution itself is the product of some sort of dialogue between different positions. It's a very difficult thing. And what I understand, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time because first you have to accept that the word of God can be interpreted, because holy books written thousands or centuries years ago were written with that language, reflected that culture. So this adaptism that he was mentioning is essential and has to be accepted. And here you have your difficulty, which is not theological, it's political. Because if adaptism is not accepted, because it's not convenient for me, because my political power can be disputed at that point. But of course, I mean, nowadays we are translating into Italian the Talmud, this gigantic ensemble of Jewish positions, doctrines, principles, and you can find in the Talmud that killing a Christian is a very good thing, and spoiling the Christians of their goods is a sort of holy duty for any Jew. So, I mean, it was written several centuries ago, and if you want to use it against the Jews today, you can do it. And in the late 18th century, the Catholics used some pieces of the Talmud to demonstrate that the Jewish community was acting against us. Civiltà Cattolica wrote articles that after you read them you can't forget them in the late 19th century. So, I mean, it can be politically used, but this is not the language of God, but it is the language of those who wrote the word of God at the time. First point. Second point, not all of these rules come from God. Most Sharia is not part of the holy words of God. It is the word of man. And of course it reflects what men were thinking. And men have always thought that subjugating women was essential for them to survive, to have control of their sexual activity, to exploit the work of women, etc., etc. And here I touch upon the last point, which is very important, the point of Francesca. This dialogue is a very nice thing. Philosophers can dialogue if they have the opportunity to meet, if all of them are free and still alive. It's very nice. But I mean, dialogue requires some levers, some strength, and in the word where things have to change. Now, if a transformation will arrive in some of these Islamic countries, this transformation will be based on the reaction of women. Because, let us be clear, religious or attributed to religion beliefs can remain accepted as successful as long as they reflect my needs, what is convenient for me, etc. If, after a while, a good part of the population feels that these beliefs are against their own dignity, their freedom, the expression of what they are and want to be, they will rebel to this thing. And if they are said by the philosophers in dialogue in the meantime that they are not acting against religion, because God never wanted this kind of disequality between sex, that men invented it, males invented it, and they want to read the holy books to preserve their power. Well, this is the historical kind of tool that is essential for a transformation that in the meantime, here, with our dialogue, we can prepare.
Thank you very much for this very brilliant and generous contribution. I think Professor Amato is quite right. I mean, one of the problems of democracy is that democracy cannot be only procedural. There must be some ethos behind democracy. This ethos comes from tradition, and within tradition there is religion. So we have to make some deal between democracy and religion. And it's very interesting to say that women can be the leaders of this reconciliation between religion and democracy. I think it's very promising. Now we have two short interventions, and I will give the floor to Valentina Gentile and Mamda Shash. I will leave my position, I go there and then you speak here.
Thank you, Professor Professor Cabral and Professor Al-Azm, for your very interesting speech and very interesting book, actually. For over 40 years now, Professor Al-Azm's critique of religious thought has been one of the most controversial and influential works on the role of religion in the Arab world. Originally published in 1969, as we said, the book has been translated and let's say exported quite late. I mean, if I'm correct, the first translation in English was 2011, right?
Yeah, it's recent.
Yeah. Which is quite strange because actually you already influenced intellectually the West, but I mean, only 40 years later they asked you for a publication of this. And today we are discussing the first translation in Italian. The work provides a sophisticated and erudite critique of religious and traditional thinking in the Arab world, understood as a significant obstacle to the development of a fully modern and rational society. For the author, however, a critical reform of Islam could not be separated from the political project of a full realization of socialism in these societies, so that a political and social renovation and religious reform seem to be two sides of the same coin. To recall what Sebastiano was saying at the beginning of the day, this is a distinctive leftist critique of religious and dogmatic thought, let's say. In particular, Professor Al-Azm's modernization and secularization project is deeply influenced by Marx's dialectical materialism. More precisely, he believes that there is a direct link between the political failure of social experiments in the Arab societies and what it takes to be a static approach to Islam. Thus, intellectual efforts of interpreting the Quran into the 20th century form of progress had to face the impossibility of performing a social, economic, and political renovation of Arab societies without reforming Islamic thinking. This reminded me like Nehru project in India in some way, and in the same way, you seem to believe that the secularization of Arab society was needed to fulfill a modern project of socialism. And obviously, Professor Al-Azm criticizes religion as a force that interferes in our lives and influences the essence of our psychological and intellectual experience. So in this way, religion determines the methods of our thinking and our reactions to the world. Religion method, in this way, is at odds with the form of thinking that characterizes modernity, which is, in your view, the form of scientific materialism. The path toward modernity is therefore imposing to redefine the place of religion in people's lives. Al-Azm recalls the decline of Christianity in the West as linked to four major events: the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, and the publication of Marx's Capital and Darwin's The Origin of the Species. To respond to these events, Christianity had to make some concessions to science. In contrast, the response of Islam to scientific developments was one of reaffirmation of traditional thought. So different ideas of reconciliation which were actually hiding a will to reaffirm in some way the traditional thought. This had a dramatic impact on politics. Even secular readers like Nasser, suggests Professor Al-Azm, were not able to embrace a form of socialism without a proper religious justification. Arab socialism, in fact, sought to accommodate religious thinking rather than challenging it. This was the intrinsic weakness of several Arab socialist projects in the 60s. It is exactly in this connection between the necessity of religious reform and the realization of socialism in Arab societies that I would like to focus in my short intervention. As a liberal scholar, I must say that an obvious reason why religion and Marxism cannot coexist is because they both present a perfectionist account of the good human life. By perfectionism, I mean an ethical doctrine that characterizes the human good and asks human development to conform to that ideal. Yet, while religion aims at the promotion of an abstract or transcendental morality, the second aims at the promotion of ethical materialism. In this sense, they are both, if we want to use the Rawlsian word, comprehensive doctrines, and to some extent incompatible with each other. From a political point of view, both views pretend to provide a perfectionist justification of the political authority while undermining pluralism. If what I'm saying is correct, we are therefore in front of two distinct but equally fundamentalist views of the good life that not only cannot be compatible with each other, but also the right forms of critical thinking and pluralism. In this sense, not only traditional religious thoughts, but any perfectionist view of the good life might endanger individual rights and freedoms and hamper democracy. In Professor Al-Azm's more recent works, he endorses a strong defense of enlightenment and universal human rights regime, thus in some way moving from this original Marxist route. Yet, it doesn't seem to see any possibility for reconciling rights and freedoms on the one end and Islamic thinking on the other. I would like to know more about your intellectual development in this sense and whether you see a new role in contemporary Arab societies for religion. Today, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, one major problem is still connected to the ways in which individual rights and freedoms can be defended in Islamic societies. Is it secularism or a sort of secularization process the right answer to this problem? In a historical moment in which the resurgence of religious sensitivities and voices proved the inadequacy of the secularization thesis everywhere in contemporary world, and I'm mentioning, Casanova's work on the new role of religion in the public sphere. So actually, the secularization thesis seems to be actually incorrect, let's say, in contemporary age. It is crucial to rethink about modernity and its alleged dependence on the secularization process. A trend in contemporary literature has emerged concerning, for instance, the idea of multiple modernities. And increasingly, scholars are trying to reconsidering the possibility to reconnect Islam and democracy, to mention a few names, Abdullah Naim or Said Hashemi, and so on. So now my questions for the future is, how is it possible, in your view, to reconcile democracy with the plurality of religious and ethical views and sensitivities?
Sorry, my hearing is not good. Could you repeat to me the question?
How is it possible, in your view, to reconcile, to make a reconciliation between these, religious views and sensitivities and other ethical frameworks with a system of rights and freedom? Would you think is it possible to distinguish a fundamentalist or a sort of traditional and fundamentalist Islam from different forms more actually compatible with democracy and rights? And if it is possible for you to think about a democratic conception of political authority which can be sincerely endorsed and supported by religious citizens, including Islamic citizens. Thank you.
It's always difficult to talk last, but I'll try. It's a great pleasure to be with my own professors, colleagues, and Professor Al-Azm. I was never his student physically, but I was from distance through his own books. I would like to start from a quote an anecdote that arrived to me, in which Professor Al-Azm is part. In Leiden, he met one of the two theologian philosophers he referred to. Arkoun and Abu Zaid in Leiden University. And they was told that at the end there is a treat. And Al-Azm said, Professor Al-Azm said, let's drink what God forbade. It means wine. One of the two, and I'm not sure which of the two, said, well, it's not sure whether God, it's not clear in the Quran whether God forbade the wine or not. And the other said, well, this is a controversial issue. I think this anecdote, it just summarizes the plurality within the Islamic intellectual life from the beginning until now. It's also, there is a book that is just out by a renowned scholar who died before his book was out, and it has received good critique and is well received in Islamic studies. It's called What is Islam? By an American Pakistani scholar, Ahmed Shahab, where he defines Islam as full of coherent incoherencies. So in the epigraph, he quotes some scholars who, just to give the example of wine, that's, some give it as an example of clear-cut divine decision, not allowed, etc. And then one of the philosophers he quotes that I have been drinking, and in my family we have been drinking wine for centuries, and we consider ourselves Muslim. So just another example of in the same line. The second point about the book, then I will make few links. I loved very much your reading of Satan, as that yes, it's amazing. So Satan didn't listen to God, but in Professor Al-Azm readings that he was actually just following one of the dictates of God. No, there is only one God, and to Him we bow. So
he was being tested by.
Yes, he was being tested. So it's like God is testing Himself with the creation of man at a certain moment, etc. For what reason, and why should human beings go into that line and follow it or not? So they are free to follow it or not. That's a point. So that question of free will, it was so much debated from the 9th to 13th centuries in Islamic history, and unfortunately since then it hardly woke up, only for the last 2 centuries. But I just wished, this is question and comment, I wished to see that a follow-up of that presentation of Satan and his choice not to kneel to Adam, but at the same time consider himself, and God allowed him that freedom, that right. You know, you will be given that chance. So tempt whom you can, and let's see at the end. So. That question of free will is needed, and one of the critiques and why some scholars of the mainstream in the Arab world don't welcome Al-Azm in their circle, and he's welcome still by others, especially the elite, is he doesn't make so much link with the tradition. So he's philosopher, he's scholar of Western philosophy, and he is well immersed in the tradition, but their critique is that he doesn't use terms or concepts from the tradition itself. So that's why, and his own compatriot, Bassam Tibi, first in some point, that's one of his, the point that didn't make of him the mainstream, or one of the mainstream scholars. Among the masses, I mean, way of appeal. For example, the case of Al-Mu'tazila. Yes. Of course, Mu'tazila, they belong to their own history, but still, if read historically, and you have that historicist spirit in mind, they also believe in reason before revelation, and revelation is only supportive to revelation. But still, like Satan, they didn't turn, let's say, atheists. That's, well, because pre-modern pre-modern times it was difficult to be atheist, however rational it might be. I wonder how, if you could say something about the lineage that you can trace, and how can that... The lineage, I mean, if you could follow up with that, your defense of the idea of free will, how you can relate it to the Mu'tazili tradition until the need of Arabs now, especially after all the political turmoil and whether Sharia is divine or semi-divine or not. I don't want to say... to go into that, but this relates to the epistemological break you call for. I mean, the scholars you also refer to, one of them is Arkoun, and later on also joined by Abu Zayd, call for an epistemological break. But not only them, and Jabir also called for an epistemological break, but it's a different one, and Abdullah Al-Arwi, and in that sense, you are closer, called for an epistemological break, and he used European concepts for his modernization project. So, in that sense, just between brackets, I have Moroccan philosophy school and Damascus philosophy school, and in Moroccan school it's summarized by three main figures: Al-Arwi, and his book also was controversial in the same period, same generation, defeat, Al-Jabri, and then Taha Abdurrahman recently came up recently. So they make three main schools in the Arab world. One is using or looking at the West and also using its own concepts, and one going back to tradition and try to renovate it and use classical or Islamic concepts, emphasizing specificity of the Arab Islamic tradition, seeing that the Arab tradition or Arab culture did not come to prominence to have historical place only with religion. So the Arabs will always have specific relationship to religion. However they secularize, however they liberalize, they have special relationship with religion, while the European context is different. It went through different history, and also the growth of, let's say, Christianity, and later on the integration of the Judaic tradition into it had its own historical circumstances. Christianity developed politically differently, especially because it came out within already established civilizations based on Greek and Roman. So it was there, but the Arab tradition developed actually through a religion that gave it that spirit, or at least that's one of the main mainstream readings of the Arab Islamic tradition. So one is built, or at least it's built as on religion. And that's why that tie is strong, or remains strong, or at least for the foreseeable future. So I wonder how far is that epistemological break? Is it radical? Is it like Promethean? Or I refer, in some reading of European Islam, I refer to Muslim Prometheus, in the sense that Prometheus doesn't need to kill God, he just, slowly or tranquilly takes the torch, and because the historical moment is different, especially because there's so much politics into it, and the Arab region is also under hegemonic internal oppression and external hegemony, so the masses mainly have a religion as an identity for resistance. And it is we cannot deny them their right to use religion as a mechanism of defense, however problematic it might be. But that is what they have, and they are working on ways of developing secular or more, let's say, flexible concepts based on religion to accommodate the diversity they have. And I think there is, however chaotic the region might seem, there is still an elitist. It remains the elitist level, a huge dynamism that we should not neglect. And the fact that there is such a book and others for or against, and the debate goes on, is great. They just come back from Morocco for a week on seminars in different cities, and it's just great to see different scholars from Al-Azm and Al-Arwi, and students of Al-Jabri or students of Taha Abdurrahman, so different schools, and so that dynamism is there, however not present. It might be still on the political scene. And the historicist spirit that Professor Al-Azm, and it was also referred to in the debate, has to be called for. For some, Islam has become a critique itself of modernity, of hegemony, and that's one other critical point put for Professor Al-Azm. So his readers say that he does not critique, he doesn't present critique of modernity, he takes it as as complete, kind of complete project. I'm sure that's, or I don't want to say I'm sure, but I think that's not how it is, but among his readers, or his critics say that he didn't present critique of modernity, European modernity. So the borrowing of terms or interest in secular liberal ideas was not followed by critique. I think, yes, I would stop there and thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, now we have a little bit of time for a few questions. Of course, we happy if you can condense your question in a short time so that Professor Al-Azm can answer afterwards. And there is a recommendation, I'm afraid, for Louis University Press. I think we should publish also the intervention of Professor Al-Azm today, because it was particularly interesting and very useful to put in context the book. But please.
Yeah, just a short and dry question to you, Professor Azm, maybe to President D'Amato. About from a Marxist point of view, I think that you put in a bunch both the Shiite.
Let me come close to you so I can hear them.
I can shout.
Yeah, but it's much better this way.
From a Marxist point of view, I think that you put in the same bunch the two main sects of Islam, Shiite and Sunni. Well, when you go to Azhar, as I did in the past, I felt a sense of desert, theological desert. When you go to Qom, as I was last week, you speak to some imams, of course, main level imams, and you feel that there is a theological discourse going on. When I was ambassador in Beirut years ago, I organized once a round table about faith and science. And I put on my sides, from one side, Ayatollah Fadlallah, who was a friend of mine, and the other side, the Grand Mufti of Lebanon, Kabani, a stupid man.
Kabani, you mean the ex...
Kabani,
he was the Mufti before this guy.
Exactly, it was 15 years ago. He was a Mufti. I cannot dwell now on the stupidity of his speeches, but when you talk to Fadlallah, unfortunately he died two years ago, you sense that he's someone who was a learned man, who had studied like a Jesuit for 13 years before becoming an imam. So my question is, don't you think that the reason why the Sunnis are lost is because they feel to be orphans of the Khalifa since 1 century, whilst the Shiites have not that kind of orphanage, because they have a clergy since ever. So how can you explain this split, this gap between the ones who now are going to commit suicide or to kill others, and there is no one Shiite in the world who is doing the same crazy.
That's not true, they did it.
No, they did it when there was a war between Iran and Iraq, and also when there are military reasons.
When they
attacked the question is clear. You say that
when they attacked the Marines,
the Shia in a better position
in Beirut, it was a suicide bomber from suicide bombing, both the French and the Americans, from Hezbollah, the Shia.
Right.
Now, the Shia, I think, tend to compensate for the fact that they are, a minority and within Islam, and the feeling that of a both grudge and of major injustice done to them. I think they tend to compensate for that by their theological learning and the focus of the Shia. But still, I don't feel that, I don't know much about Shia thought, but I don't feel that there was a real breakthrough in their thinking outside the universe of discourse and its parameters of Shiism. So neither side of Islam have really broken out of that.
Yeah, I think that we can collect other questions if there are.
Yeah, and then of course, Wilayat Faqih came, as Imam reminded me, which in a way is worse than the Khilafah, because it's, he's the Naib al-Imam, he's the vice Imam, okay, who's ruling now Iran and running the Shia affair.
Yeah, we can collect a couple, 2-3 questions if you want, so that Professor Al-Azm can respond all together. And I think that you are right in some way. If you consider the percentage of oil income in Iran and Saudi Arabia, you see that in Saudi Arabia is around 80%, in Iran is about 30%, which means that there has been a conversion, which is very positive in general. So I don't think there are doubts that the Shia world is performing better now. And you were right, Ambassador, but please, some space for other questions.
I have 2 questions. Morocco claims, or the King of Morocco claims, that they are leading moderate Islam in Morocco. And they have this agenda to prevail it around, whether it's Africa, whether it's the rest of the Middle East. What's your opinion on that? And second question, how long Daesh is going to be there?
Other questions that we can collect some of them if you want. Doctor,
my impression of what is going on in Morocco, so
I want to collect some questions for you. I'll let you answer. But don't worry, go on.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead.
These are temporary political arrangements that have to do with the moment. Whether they are, a breakthrough over, a longer run, I'm not very sure about that. And we see something similar in the struggle in Iraq. Okay? And because of the impasse, now they are talking about a government of technocrats. They don't like the word secular government. They don't like the euphemism for secular government, حكومة مدنية, okay, civil government. So they resort to the word technocrats and so on. But the essence of it is that the government should be neither Shia, nor Sunni, nor Kurdi. Okay, it has to be Iraqi. Whether they will, succeed in this or not, I don't know. In this, now Daesh, I think, will remain there as long as Obama's policy on Syria is let Syria bleed. And while Syria bleeds, it is bleeding Hezbollah, it is bleeding Iran, it is bleeding Russia, and is bleeding itself. So all those who are bleeding now have been traditionally anti-West. And so let them, drain their blood. So the vacuum that was created by the withdrawal of the state of Assad and so on. And this policy of let Syria bleed, what created the soil and the time and the anger, okay, that permitted Daesh to organize and conquer, I think. So now Syrians on the whole are hoping that the new president, what will be coming in the United States, will try to clean up the mess left by Obama, the way Obama tried to clean up the mess that was left by his predecessor, by Bush. So, but I don't think that Daesh is a permanent or long-lasting phenomenon any more than Al-Qaeda. And in Syria, there is no real popular constituency for Daesh. It was imposed from the outside.
My question is linked to what Professor Corral was saying before about the problem of legitimating political power and what Dr. Valentina Gentile was saying about the conditions of pluralism in modern societies. Your defense of the scientific method your defense of the scientific method in modern societies in conditions of basic reasonable pluralism, using John Rawls' terminology, seems to be connected precisely with this idea of justifying propositions which claim a form of universal validity. And in this sense, this idea of the scientific method as a common justificability of propositions which claim to have a form of universal acceptance in society, which are still divided. And your personal experience in Lebanon in the 60s and 70s testifies this kind of divisions. It's linked, this idea of acceptability, universal acceptability, and then justifiability, public justification, with the contemporary liberal interpretation of the Kantian idea of the public use of reason. And so my question is, how this idea of public reasoning and its Kantian roots may be interpreted in contemporary Arab societies, in particular the role of public intellectuals in those societies. Because in the 60s and the 70s, it seems that in your case, you're exemplar in this sense. The voice of public intellectuals, both from the left and on more nationalist positions, had a specific role to play. Nowadays, also due to geostrategic conditions, it seems to have much less to say. The hope, obviously, is this is not the case.
Well, the role of public reason in, for example, under Nasser in Egypt, Nasser never appealed to religion to justify his rule. And apropos of what the colleague said, he did not attack religion, but basically he marginalized it. And the institutions of the state were receding from the control of the traditional control of religion over them, whether education, the judiciary, the army, all these, went out of the control of the traditional ulama and religious doctrine. The doctrine of the army became not jihad, became nationalist. Okay. The educational system became, tried to be as modern as it can. And Nasser abolished the Sharia courts early in his rule, and all courts became civil courts. And of course, there is a reaction to that, and this is what the idea of the Islam al-Hal, okay, and the application of Sharia is because the Sharia is not really applied except in Iran and Saudi Arabia. In this
Lebanon.
In
Lebanon.
Sharia? Is it applied in Lebanon?
Non, le droit de famille.
Sorry?
The family, the code of family.
Civilian code.
Yeah, okay. Sharia is not applied except for personal, everywhere, except for personal family law.
Marriage.
Actually, it's interesting that the only thing left for the religious establishment is marriage, divorce, death, inheritance, and so on. Okay. And they feel that they have been disinherited from something that they regard as their, historic domain of control, and all these have come out of their control and went into, more modern and secular forms. But the secularism was always de facto. It was never de jure. It was never declared. And this is here apropos of the mention of Ataturk. Ataturk was a war hero. He saved Turkey from colonization by the Allies after the war. So he could stand up and declare from the top, okay, separation of state and church and mosques, okay. But in the Arab world, all fell under colonial rule, okay. And to some extent, Islam was a source for the anti-colonial, a resource for the anti-colonial struggles in various Arab colonized part. Now, there was a moment when Nasser, when he nationalized the Suez Canal, and this was the peak of his popularity, especially after the Suez War in '56. I think if he had the courage to do like Ataturk in that moment as a war hero, okay, say, okay, separation of state and mosque in Egypt, probably it would have worked.
Why didn't he do it? Why he didn't do it?
Well, I think there is no really answer. It's just, he didn't do it, okay? It may be, personal conviction, it may be sentiment, it may be political calculations, okay? And he was fighting on so many fronts that he didn't want, to open a new front. Because there's another story about Nasser in this. In those days, the day when you start Ramadan and you start Ta'ib were contentious politically. Okay, the progressive camp led by Egypt, and there was the reactionary camp led by Saudi Arabia in those days. Okay, and so at one point it became something a bit of scandalous. So some of the astronomers in Egypt went to Nasser and said, look, we can calculate this very carefully by the second, okay, when it starts and when not. And he basically told them, not now, okay, because I don't want to open a front. Yeah. Not now, I don't want to open a new front, against so he didn't even do that. Even there was in 1964, there was an argument going on between Saudi Arabia and Egypt over whether the earth is flat or goes around the sun, the cosmology. And that's, this is why I wrote my book. It was so scandalous, these things going on.
I think, we could speak for hours about that, but there is not so much time, so I would permit the last question by Mrs.
It's only a very small comment on the ambassador proposed Shia and Sunni. I would like to ask how many Fatlallah we have in the Shia groups, and also we have Fatlallah al-Nasrallah, who is leading the war in Syria.
So it's complicated. I thank you very much, Professor Al-Azm, for this very, very nice presentation. I think the materials you submit to us were fundamental. The book was written almost 50 years ago, but I never saw something written 50 years ago which is so contemporary. So thank you again. Thank you to Louis University Press for the effort to translate and publish this book. I hope and think that there will be further meetings with Professor Al-Azm discussing these very interesting topics. And we'll finish today because we've been at length discussing it. And thank you to all for participating in a very vivid way to this very stimulating intercourse. Thank you.